We begin our studies with the sounding of the shofar. We do this because of the significance of this instrument that is used to call God's people, the Jew. Uses the shofar to call them to worship, to a gathering, as well as to warn them of impending danger. We see in Ezekiel 33 the description of the duty of the watchman, as well as the responsibility of the people who hear this warning sound. God declares to Ezekiel, "Again the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, speak to the children of your people, and say to them, When I bring a sword upon a land, and the people of the land take a man from their territory and make him their watchman, when he sees the sword coming upon the land, if he blows the trumpet and he warns the people, then whoever hears the sound of the trumpet and does not take warning, if the sword comes and takes him away, his blood shall be on his own head, because he heard the sound of the trumpet, but he did not take warning. His blood shall be upon himself. But he who takes warning will save his life. But if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet, and the people are not warned, and the sword comes and takes any person from among them, he is taken away in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at the watchman's hand." Now, every preacher is a watchman, and every believer has the responsibility to respond to the call of the shofar, that trumpet sound, that warning that we are living in perilous times and dangers ahead. And we are living in perilous times. And we must pay attention to God's declarations to be attentive to the signs of the times. So today we continue our study in the Olivet Discourse as Jesus answers another of the disciples' questions. Jesus is going to warn them of the impending destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple, and he gives them instruction as to what to do when they see this given sign. So as the shofar sounds, it is time for us to prepare to study the Word of God so that we can stand strong and remain faithful in these last days. The theme of this series of Bible studies is Ready or Not, Jesus is Coming. The Scriptures have much to say about this topic, and our focus currently is on the Olivet Discourse, which is Matthew 25, along with Mark 13 and Luke 21. These three important passages making up this important teaching of Jesus. And as you know, it's simply called the Olivet Discourse because Jesus and his disciples were on the Mount of Olives at the time, which overlooks the city of Jerusalem and overlooks the Temple Mount. In our past studies, we have discussed several things. First, in video 1, we discussed the historical setting, what's taking place in Israel and Jerusalem, first century AD. We have also discussed the three questions that the disciples asked, which was, number 1, tell us when these things will happen. Number 2, what will be the sign of your coming? And number 3, what is the sign of the end of the age? We have also addressed some general characteristics of the church age, the time in which we live, which is inhabited with false messiahs and rumors of wars. And then we have also examined Jesus' prophecy of the sign that signifies the last days have begun. And we discovered that World War I and World War II really fit that description. And they acted as a catalyst that started the migration of the Jews back into the Promised Land, from which they had been driven after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which we will be discussing today. Now, for the events of the end times to take place, this migration had to happen. Jesus declared that this event would be the beginning birth pangs or labor pains of a much greater period of judgment upon the earth. Now, this was the answer to the disciples' third question. And then in our last study, we discussed the persecution that the apostles and subsequent generations, even our generations, have suffered and will continue to suffer during the church age. So today our focus is going to be on Luke chapter 21, beginning with verse 20 and reading through verse 24. And in this passage, Jesus answers their first question, which was, "Tell us when these things will happen." And now that's a reference to Jesus' prophecy concerning the destruction of the temple, and not one stone would be left upon another, as well as the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. So we'll remember that Jesus doesn't answer their questions in order that they were asked. So it's very important that we identify which question Jesus is answering as we study the Olivet Discourse. So in Luke chapter 21, verse 20 through 24, Jesus is answering that first question. And it will be a question that really is answered and is applicable to the people of that time, as we'll find out in a moment. So let's begin by reading Luke 21, beginning with verse 20. "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Jerusalem flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days. For there will be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword, and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." Now, folks, this is a prophecy that was fulfilled in the lifetime of the disciples, as we'll see in just a moment. So remember, Jesus has prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple, and that is what prompted these questions. Now, in the verses we just read, Jesus clearly indicates the sign of the coming destruction of Jerusalem. He says, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies." Now, folks, that would be a pretty good indicator that Jerusalem, both the city and its people, are in grave danger. This is a prophecy that directly concerns them, because it will happen in their generation. Now, what is Jesus' counsel to them, and to whom is he talking in these verses? Well, Jesus is talking to Jewish believers living in that day, and he's talking about events which came to pass between 66 and 70 AD. Now, what does Jesus tell these folks to do? Well, he says they are not to take up their swords and fight to defend the city. This was not their purpose. This was not, in essence, their war. He said they should not fight. Instead, they were to find a way out of the city. And if they were outside of the city, they were not to go in to help and defend it. Now, why? Well, as Jesus said a moment ago, as we read those verses, Jesus said, "Because these are days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled." You see, this was a prophetic statement of the predetermined purpose of God. This was God's vengeance on those that had committed the unpardonable sin of rejecting the Messiah. Now, in verses 23 and 24 of this passage, Jesus pronounces a woe. And he says, there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. And the people he's talking about are the unbelieving Jews. They will be killed with the sword and dispersed throughout the world as captives to all nations. Now, We call this, and it's known to us as the diaspora. And for over 2,000 years, the Jews were scattered throughout the world after the destruction of Jerusalem. So the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple and the dispersion of the Jews was part of what is known as the times of the Gentiles. The Jews, during the times of the Gentiles, were to be trampled underfoot until the times of the Gentiles are to be fulfilled. Now, this fulfillment has not happened yet. So what is this referring to, the times of the Gentiles? Well, it's the period of time in which the Gentiles hold domination over the Jewish people. And we are living in the times of the Gentiles. We're in the last days of it, but we are living in those days. This began with the Babylonian captivity in 586 BC, when the last king in David's line, Jehoiakim, was removed from the throne. There has not been a king from the line of David sitting upon the throne since then. The times of the Gentiles ends when a king from the line of David once again sits on the throne. Now, we know from prophetic scripture that this will only happen when the Messiah establishes his kingdom, and the king will be King Jesus. This happens after the second coming of Christ. Now, the way this was fulfilled is amazing. The way that the destruction of Jerusalem came to pass is in this way. In the year 66 AD, the Roman army came and besieged the city of Jerusalem, assuming that they were only facing a little local revolt. The Messianic community, and when I talk about the Messianic community, I'm talking about Messianic Jews. I'm talking about Jews that have trusted Jesus as their Messiah. So the Messianic community at that point took that to be the sign that Jesus had been speaking about when the armies have surrounded the city of Jerusalem. And they began to seek ways to leave the city. But with the Romans setting out there, they couldn't do so. But this was part of God's plan, and God's plan cannot be thwarted. So the general of the Romans, a man by the name of Cestus Gallus, began to realize, coincidence, right? Began to realize that the revolt was much more extensive and Jewish forces were cutting his supply lines. He was forced to lift the siege of Jerusalem and return to Caesarea. So temporarily, the city was no longer under siege. And at that time, the Messianic community took the opportunity to abandon the city. They were joined by Jewish believers from Judea, which is the southern portion of the nation of Israel, from the Galilee, which would be the northern portion up around the Sea of Galilee, and also from the Golan, which would be the hill country to the northeast of the Sea of Galilee. We know it as the Golan Heights today, and it's bordered by Lebanon to the north and Jordan to the east. Now, these refugees, if you want to call them that, these Messianic Jews that had left Jerusalem and left Galilee and left the Golan, went to a city called Pella. Now, I'm not talking about the one in Iowa. They went to a city called Pella, which is just south of the Sea of Galilee, but it's on the east side of the Jordan River, in what we know as Jordan today. And therefore, being in Pella, being in that area, they were outside the war zone and they were safe. Now, folks, some horrifying statistics come from history. A total of 1.1 million Jews were killed in the Roman war between 66 and 70 AD. But another astonishing statistics comes. That is not one single Jewish believer, not one Messianic Jew lost his life. Why was that? Well, because of their obedience to the admonitions of Jesus in this prophecy. So with these words, Jesus answered their first question. The sign of the coming destruction of Jerusalem Jesus has answered two of the disciples' questions to this point: the sign when the age is approaching, and the sign when Jerusalem is about to be destroyed. So now he's going to begin to pave the way for the answer to their second question, which will be the sign of his coming. And folks, that's going to be quite an extensive study. So we'll need to pick up there next time. So until then, let me repeat Paul's words of encouragement to the believers at Corinth when he told them to watch, stand fast in the faith, be brave, be strong, and let all that you do be done with love. Shalom.